So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This is our first session of our manuscript writing series, and we are very excited to see you all here virtually anyway. So we just had some little advertisements on the screen as you enter. You can see our schedule. I know most of you are probably signed up for all the other events, but if you aren't yet, you probably still have time to come and register, at least for our Zoom sessions. You can see our scientific editing services that we have here at ICTR, as well as the resources at Marshfield Clinic. So if my computer works, it will go to the next slide. There we go. So what's really cool about this series is that it is a collaboration between ICTR here at UW and Marshfield Clinic Research Institute, or you might hear us say MCRI. So this is a collaboration that started in 2007 between the organizations. So if you don't know anything about ICTR, we'll start there. So we are here to help train. We provide guidance to investigators and scientists across all levels. So it could be anybody from a graduate student, a postdoc, clinician, all the way to senior faculty. And what's really great is that we are working with Marshfield, who provide services to the rural Wisconsin community. And so we can do translational research with them. And we've gotten really good reviews from investigators that can use both services. And so we are here on both sides for anybody that needs our services. So what we wanted to talk about first was that, who all joined this writing seminar series. We put this out, we weren't sure how many people would be interested in this. And what we found was that actually a lot of you were. So just in our first, day of the registration being opened, our in-person editing series, it was space limited and those filled up very, very quickly. So we just wanted to talk about all of you who joined us. So in total, we had over 200 individuals sign up. You can see the organizations that were represented. So we have people from UW, we have people from UW Health, Marshfield, and then we have some interesting guests from Aurora. They are one of our affiliates. And then we have some people from different universities. And so I'd be interested to know how they found out about us. I'm guessing through some good collaborations that we have. And then just within the university system, we have 79 different programs. So this could be schools, colleges, anything within the UW system. So it's just super interesting to see who's all here, who's all interested in manuscript writing, because I know it's really difficult. We don't really get taught how to write. So I'm glad that our services that we're offering are beneficial for you guys. So since there are so many of you here, we wanted to do a quick poll to sort of see who you are, get a sense of, what you're coming in with. So if you don't mind, team, could you get the poll going? So we're just going to spend a few minutes, if you don't mind, answering these questions, a little bit of an icebreaker before we get started. So nobody is saying I don't procrastinate. Oh, one person. Yes. I love it. Answers are still coming in. So. Okay. We'll just let those go for a few more minutes. It's just more for fun to see what you guys do. Understanding how many manuscripts you've written, could be helpful for us. And I wanted to pose that as ones you've written, not ones you've published, because those are two different things. You don't always, have to have a publication to call that experience in writing. And then, what do you do when you procrastinate? That's just fun. I like to bother my pets when I'm procrastinating. All right. Got to get that out of my way. Nope, it popped back up. Okay, so let's get started on today. So today, like I mentioned, is our first event of this series. So this is our manuscript planning series. Our goal was to sort of create a semester-long webinar series that would sort of match the process of writing a manuscript. So we're going to start with the planning phase. So what do you do in the beginning before you even have written anything down on your document? And so we're starting with speakers. I'm Jen Merems. I'll tell you a little bit about myself in a minute. And then we have Bernadette Gillick, who is going to be talking about the meat of the manuscript planning. And then we have David, probably going to mispronounce your last name, Puthoff. I've only said it in my head, so saying it out loud is a little different. He's going to talk about writing techniques. So we have a great lineup today. And if you don't mind, just, keep your videos off, ask questions in the chat as they pop in your head. We have a team in the background who's going to be looking them over, compiling them, and then asking us speakers along the way. So like I mentioned, my name is Jen Merems. I'm a science editor here at ICTR. I have a little bit of an interesting background. You can see I studied wildlife ecology. However, I do have about 9 years of editing, writing, and publishing experience. So I've done a whole host of things from scientific writing to more plain language scientific communication with magazines and online articles and things like that. And so currently my role with science editing is I get to work with all of the great people here in the med school and our affiliates, looking at their manuscripts, their grants, their proposals, pretty much anything that they might need help on. I am here to provide sort of customized development and edits for them. So my job here today is sort of to talk about the ugly truth of writing and give you guys a sense of different scientific writing styles before we dive into manuscript planning. So what I want you to remember today and moving forward is that you can't learn how to be a good writer with just a 1-hour seminar or just this 1 semester long series. I found some really good quotes that I thought were related, especially for this environment of medical professionals. The beautiful part of writing is that you don't have to get it right the first time, unless you're a brain surgeon. That's kind of important to get right when you're doing the surgery. However, writing, it's like an evolution. You never have to be perfect. You just have to be constantly growing. And then another one is that there are no apprentices. We are all apprentices in this craft, and no one is ever perfect. And so we were talking early on in this planning, and David said something to me when we were trying to figure out the name of this series. And I wanted to say, like, learning how to be an expert, in manuscript writing. And he was like, no, we're never experts. We're always just growing and learning how to be better. And that, stuck with me because it's very true. There's no experts in writing because it takes time to be better. And we're always growing. So what is scientific writing? Well, it's a technical form of writing. We typically do it for other peers that are in the science realm. So it's typically more complex. It's framed problems in this sort of research context. And we tend to write it in formats that people can easily skim because we're busy. We're not going to sit there for hours and hours and read these really complex materials. What we're going to do is we're going to skim it for these major findings, whether it's the introduction, the abstract, the discussion section, and then maybe if something's of interest there, we'll dive deeper into the material. So we're really just writing for each other to, inform other scientists of what we're doing. So the key characteristics of scientific writing is that it's concise and it's precise. So again, the audience is other scientists. So we have this sort of language that we assume we all know with this jargon that we're working with. So we're allowed to use that in this sense of scientific writing that we cannot use in other, genres. And then we cite current literature. So again, scientific writing is to help us sort of evolve the field. So we discover something, we write about it, and we pass that along to the next scientist so they can build off that. So some of these are going to be dependent on the genre of writing you're doing. So I'm going to quickly talk about different scientific genres. So the first we're going to talk about today, because obviously the series is about manuscript writing, so your journal articles. So again, these are publications that share the research that we're currently working on. There's a lot of different types of journal articles. So you could get like literature reviews, you can get, special features, things like that. But this is just sort of it in a general sense. So your purpose and your audience, again, it's going to be for other scientifically minded folks that are most likely within your realm of science. So you're sharing those results with those other scientists. Your style and convention, you're going to be precise, you're going to be concise, you're going to have lots of visuals, lots of data that's showing your results because that's what's most important. And then we have this more organizational flow. So we have our abstract, our title, our, intro, methods, results, discussion, and then sometimes, depending on what you're doing, you could have conclusion, little tiny other details. But overall, that organization is very particular across the board. And then we could go into other genres such as research proposals. So these would be things like your grants, your IRBs, other kind of proposal materials to get funding. So this can be very dependent on your funder, the organization you're working with. So it's a little bit different and a little bit more complex if you look at that photo at the bottom. It can be a little bit more challenging. So what you're trying to do here is to convince a group of people that you're deserving of this money, right? And a lot of times it's a lot of money. So there's a lot of effort and emotions put behind this document that you're submitting, that you're trying to show that you're deserving of this, right? So your audience might be people that don't know exactly what you're doing. It could be more general to the science, and you're trying to talk about this specific thing you're studying. So there's sort of this tightrope you're walking of sharing too much detailed information versus being broad enough so that, review panel can understand. And then again, your purpose is to persuade them. So how can you write the best way possible to persuade them to give you the money? So your style here is you want it to be readable. Again, you don't want that scientific jargon that might just be really specific to your study. If I start throwing out wildlife terms, most of you here might not totally understand what I'm talking about, right? But there are ways I can work around that so you can understand, my small field of wildlife. So you want those goals and objective of what you're going to do with that funding to also be very evident so they can effectively understand what you're going to do. And again, organization is going to be extremely dependent. So you can see how different that is just from our manuscripts that we were just discussing. And then the last scientific topic I'm going to talk about today, or the genre, is our science communication. So those plain language summaries, any sort of writing that you're doing from the general public. So this is when we're getting rid of all of that jargon. You want your communication to be consistent across anybody, whether that, well, it depends who you're talking to, whether your audience is little kids versus, an elderly population. You want to adjust your jargon to meet those needs of those individuals. So your audience might not be familiar with your study. They might not be familiar with your research. They might be a little bit familiar. So it's quite different. So your purpose is to entertain them as well as educate them. So again, you want to use clear language, and then your organization is going to be extremely dependent on what you're doing. So this includes, like I mentioned, plain language summaries, which can be really important in the field of medical research because we want our audience to know what we're doing, especially if they are the participants of a study. If you're telling them how they contributed, what you gained from their participation, you're going to want to explain that in language they can understand, right? This might be a little hard to read. I just copied it from a manuscript. And so one thing, keep in mind of your figures and what they look like when you publish. So this just shows how beneficial plain language summaries can be. So it can be accessible, it can be inclusive, it increases equity and diversity because it can reach larger groups of people. And then it just goes into a little bit more detail about, how it benefits authors, research funders, things like that. And then at the bottom of this graph, what they were looking at was they were describing research in different ways across just 3 groups. It doesn't really matter if the group was psoriasis, multiple sclerosis, or whatnot. But what I found the most interesting was that they described the same, results. They did one using just infographics, so a lot of figures, a lot of tables. They used one with low complexity language, and then they sort of went to more and more complexity language. And they found that people understood the best and really appreciated the information when it was, the infographics. So when it was showed to them in the most easy to understand way. So really think about those things when you are dealing with plain language summaries. But we're talking about manuscripts. And so manuscripts, we get to be more complex. So just some points to remember before I throw it off to our next speaker is that writing a scientific article, a manuscript, a grant proposal, whatever it might be, it's a work of art. And it's honed with lots and lots of experience. So you can't do it, like I said, in a 1-hour webinar. You're not going to leave here experts. It can take years and years and years, and you're never going to be perfect. Just know each time you're getting a little better. Each word, you're growing. So never stop. Success doesn't come from just writing, but you need to write effectively. Again, you need to be concise, precise, but you also need to adjust for your audience, your purpose, and really, fine tune what you're doing for that specific, writing material. And then it's the author's job to make the reader's job easier. So as a writer, you want your writer or your reader to understand what you're talking about. So that's your job to make it easy for them to understand, right? And then you don't succeed by getting papers published. We succeed by getting them cited. So that links us back to, if you can write effectively, the reader can read it. And then if the reader can read it, they'll cite you because they know what you said. If they don't understand your manuscript, you're not going to get cited because they'll have no idea what you said, right? So those are really important. So how do we do all of this? Well, we have to start with a good plan. And so that is when we're going to bring in our next speaker, Bernadette Gillick. And I'm hoping she is here now.
I am here. I've been here. Very nice introduction. I'll jump right in, and I'll just say next slide when I'm ready, Jen. Thanks so much. So my name is Bernadette Gillick. I am the director of the research design module within ICTR, and I work with Jen and also Leanne Marotic, specifically towards protocol development programs. So I'm really excited to be here. And I will go to the next slide in terms of how to plan for success and approach the writing. So I'm gonna do this quick speed thought exercise if everybody's in. And I appreciate there's a couple people with videos on so I can see. Are you in, Aziza? Please, that'd be awesome. Okay, Shamya? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to go through this. Try to just block out everything else. If you're doing your emails, if you're actually listening, whatever it is, I hope you're here to try to get into this. So if you could hit the next bullet point. So here's the thought process. So think of an article that really made an impression on you. There's got to be an article with everybody here on an article that really made an impression on you. Next, the next thought is, do you remember what the topic was about? So do you remember truly what the topic was about for that article? Yes. Next one. Do you remember the authors? Like who they were, where they were from, what institution, what country, maybe even where they were in terms of their own degrees. Maybe someone was an undergrad, maybe someone had a PhD. Next is do you remember the year it was published? And a lot of people can actually cite articles and say, well, in 1993, there was this, and then 2003, and then 2020. And especially if it was when they were doing their PhD thesis, for example, they remember like 200, 400, 600 articles. And so really thinking about these articles that made an impression on you. Now, the next one, please. Do you remember what journal it was in? Sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. So as Jen just said, it's really, what was the importance of the article? What was the impression of it to you? And then was that article actually cited elsewhere? Next, please. So the other speed thought exercise is if we lock the doors on all of you, like Aziza, your door just locked behind you, okay? And said, you've got 24 hours and the only thing you can do is write. What would you want to write about? Like, what would you really want to write about if it was like time off, the whole world's going to stop for 24 hours and you get to write? Next, Jen. So it's, why is that important to you? Is it important to you? Maybe it's something you have to do and you don't want to write it, but maybe it's really important to you and you want to write it. Next. And why would you think it would add value to the current literature? Why would anybody want to read it? So I think also when we put on our hat about how to write a manuscript, sometimes we write it for us and we're never thinking about the audience, who's going to read it. So we just write it for us and really we're not thinking about how it would add value and how it would be interpreted. Next, please. And then what's holding you back from writing it is the big question. And we're all going to talk about that. David will probably have a lot of good points on this, but all throughout this entire series about writing manuscripts and beyond, it's really what's holding you back from writing it. If you could get next slide, please. So why publish? This was kind of touched on, publish or perish. We need to talk about what we do and we need people to actually see some value in it. And hopefully in the meantime, we help others through our work and publishing it and add to the current state of the science. So what it is this written document of our findings and submitted to a scientific journal for publication. But why publish it? Well, we can share that information. We can get feedback, especially if you're open to getting the feedback and improving, which is a really important piece. And it allows you to establish where you are in that as a member of that research community. The other thing that I didn't put that on there as a bullet point is because you need to do so for your job, because you might need to do it for tenure. The nuts and bolts of, hey, this is part of our life. And when I started as a faculty, one of my senior mentors said, yeah, it's publish and perish. Basically, your currency is grants and publications. Get used to it. And so how are you going to make that more comfortable than actually some sort of uncomfortable challenge, and get into it and be able to share what you know? So there's all different types of manuscripts, and you'll learn a lot more about these in the upcoming discussions. But it's also worthwhile to identify and use wonderful resources like scientific editors such as Jen to be able to identify what type of manuscript would this be and where would it best be suited. Next slide, please. So when should I start writing a manuscript? And I put question marks on the end of this because when do you feel like you have enough data, you have enough meat for the manuscript? Do you have to wait for the end of a 5-year randomized clinical trial to share what you've been doing? Probably not going to be the only time that you should publish about some of the things that you're doing is to wait 5 years. But are your sample sizes meaningful? Do you have half of one, an N of one? Do you have 20? And that's a really good number. Do you have 2,000? And that's actually not enough. So what does it mean in your field? So what is the size that you have, the data that reaches statistically significance or not? When are you able to actually publish about a study? And do your results tell a story? And that's another session on the Learn How to Tell a Story that's coming up on April 9th, which is an exciting plug. Try to write that rough outline or draft to expose any holes to really understand what do I not have? And we'll talk about the outline of the manuscript too. And when have you identified your main point or the global message? So what is one most important finding you want the reader to know about? And that's what I was talking about in that thought exercise. And then make all of those complex findings into concise messages and be able to, for the readers to grasp. We gave a couple examples of some titles, some direction to go, but some of the most exciting moments in my own laboratory are when we're talking about the title of whatever we're submitting. Because it really is, what kind of title should we put on this? What are we really trying to say? And how can we be attractive for individuals to say, I want to read that article. That's really cool. Some of the best titles I've seen for articles are 3 or 4 words long. They figured out a way to get my attention and to say, okay, wow, what's that? And often they have a question mark at the end of that the title too. Next slide, please. So what goes where? This is very basic, not for every type of journal, not for every type of manuscript, but I think the important pieces are abstract, intro, materials and methods, results, discussions, and conclusions. It is an interesting type of preparation when you talk to different people who are writing for scientific journals and you ask them, where do you start? I went to a 3-day writing seminar when I first started as faculty decades ago. And they started with, the first thing you should sit down and write is the introduction. And I knew right then that it was probably not the best writing seminar for me, because the first thing I like to write is the methods. It's easy. I know what I've done and I can actually get into it. And then I pull it up and down and look at it just like I would stretch taffy to say, what do I want to use that for? And really the introduction with the why is tricky to write sometimes, and the discussion with the significance and how it compares to other studies out there and our future suggestions for future studies or interpretation can be tricky. And those are really interactive types of places within a journal, within an article, to work with the team with whom you're writing. So these are some goals that you have as well. Next slide. Who contributes as an author? Okay, others are going to talk about this too. There's actually a pretty good article that was just published a few years ago on Authorship Issue Explained was the title of the article, talking about authorship, and that's the PMID number. So really figuring out what's your role, with whom have you worked on this study? Is there an order to authorship? Which actually there is oftentimes, more often than not. And when is the best time to discuss authorship? And I'll just briefly say that the first author should be the person who likely contributed the most to the work, especially in scientific writing, including the majority of the writing of the manuscript. This is directly taken from this article. The sequence should be determined by the relative overall contributions, and it's common practice to have the senior author appear last. I don't agree with the statement sometimes regardless of his or her or their contribution. And the senior author, like other authors, should meet all criteria for authorship. I've gone up to senior authors and said, that was an incredible article. Can you tell me more about what that study was? And the person's like, never saw it, don't know. That was within my lab, but I never read it. So that disturbs me a little bit, because we like to actually be involved in it and understand who and why and the ethics of that. And that's a discussion that we're about to have as well within this series. When is the best time to discuss authorship? I do want to make a quick note. The moment you think of the research question, Before you write the grant, before you start everything, if you think about the team with whom you're going to potentially work on this, start thinking about authorship, start thinking about who you're going to get involved with, and think about who that team is who might write. It may change, it likely will, but actually start thinking about authorship right away. It will also be facilitatory towards actually publishing because you're thinking about what the articles could be. It will change, but it's a good time to think about it. Next slide. Where should I publish? I don't know, but it's exciting to think about. So over 80,000 academic peer-reviewed English journals in 2019, and 30,000 are classified as medicine and health. And so one thing that we wanted to make mention of, and we'll get into a little bit more about where you should publish in the details, the NIH has issued recommendations for authors to ensure credibility of the research finding when publishing. I myself have submitted to 2 unknown predatory journals. I've lost over $5,000 in submitting to those journals. And those were 2 of my best works. And they caught me and they got me and I lost. And so what I did learn from that is actually to make sure that I looked at Beale's list, for example, and I put that here, who is a librarian who's now in Colorado, who actually continues to pursue predatory journals and state who these predatory journals are. So it's a helpful way, next slide, to actually look at, and this is pulled from Beale's list, all the publishers that they have that this team has now found that are predatory journals, to make sure that you're actually not trying to publish in a journal that doesn't exist and that will not formally be published, or that is actually indexed as well. So something to keep in mind. And I'm just being brief, but I'm giving a little bit of an example. And then next slide. The criteria for evaluating a journal, we have these in your slides in terms of the rigor. And just for time's sake, I won't go through each bullet point underneath, but the rigor, the editorial quality, the peer review process, the ethics, and the editorial board members. When I sit with individuals and talk about where do you think you might want to publish, or when people are thinking and considering where they might want to publish, oftentimes they're not thinking about these things. They're thinking, where do you think I can get in? Where do you think I'll get published? And I think sometimes we also need to really make sure we understand these criteria for evaluating the journal so that we can understand if our work fits well, and that will be more successful towards where you can get published. Next slide. This blends also with what we were talking about in terms of the reputation, whether or not they're predatory, their aims, their mission, their author rights and copyright, and then also the importance of the impact factor, the PubMed impact factor, and how that relates to your strength or your perceived strength as a scientist, and where you publish and how many times you've been cited. So all of these things come into play, and it's something to consider, and to really be sure to work with a team and your mentoring team to understand further where best your work would be suited. Next slide. So how to plan for success, approach the writing to writing manuscripts. In summary, if we lock the doors, what would you want to write about? I think that's an important piece. It's hard to write a manuscript you don't want to write. It's really hard. And sometimes that creativity just won't come, even if you're thinking, I've got to do this and the deadline's there, and I set clocks and I give myself gifts and all the tricks that we do. You've got to figure out the best way that you can write and what it is that you're writing and what's holding you back from writing it. And these pictures are all pictures I have of individuals with whom I've worked in my studies. This is why I write. These are the people with whom I work. I work in infant stroke, babies who have a bleed in their brain, and these kids motivate me to say, write, sit down, do it, and actually try to share what we've learned to help people in the future. And you may have your own motivating factor. Next slide. Thank you very much. These are the other things that motivate me in my life to actually be able to do things like this. So I appreciate the time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
We do have a few minutes for questions if anybody. Ooh, it's one of you guys have your mics on. If anybody has questions, if you want to put it in the chat, we have time. And Bernadette, here, I'll start with a question. Can you, for those who don't know what a predatory journal is, do you think you could provide us a little sentence about it?
And I'm sure that David probably can also expound upon this, but the predatory journals are journals that are not truly, there are no publishers behind them, or they are fake publishers behind them. And they have a full process for submission, review, for submitting dollars to publish, and it will show you their editorial group and all of these different things that you can actually find these people, but they're actually not part of the editorial editorial committee. Myself, I actually was put on an editorial committee for a predatory journal, and I was not on the editorial committee for that journal. So they are actually looking to bring you in and create the opportunity that you think for publication, but they are actually not truly publishing. So they're predatory and that they're fake, and that they are using the opportunity to use your information and make money. Is there another question in the chat?
So actually, that was the same question I had.
Great.
So.
Okay.
So we have another question for you. Do you know off the top of your head, and this you might not, do you know what sort of a good number is to look for with impact factor when trying to pick a journal?
That's a great question. So that very much depends upon your domain. And that in specific, I will say, so if you're in a very specific field, you may have impact factors that might be lower or higher than other types of fields in terms of the journals in which you can publish. That would actually allow you to have more citations, to have more people in your field read it. So it depends upon what you're doing, where you're trying to share your information, and what that range might be. Some institutions actually are promoting that you publish in journals with specific impact factors. That's a good thing to understand if you're taking a position or in a position at those institutions, to know that they actually do have a cutoff for different impact factors. But they do actually also factor into different indices, such as an H index. So if an H index is important towards tenure or beyond, it's good to know what different factors are seen in that way. So I would not give a range, because I think that varies from different disciplines and domains.
Can you mention what an H factor is, since you brought it?
Sure. I will mention that there, like I said, are different indices that take in different components of the impact factor, the number of citations, how many citations you have, or how many publications you have, and over what period of time. And that can give you a number or even a ratio in some instances for index, for H index or other indices. And that can be part of how you're assessed for your proficiency and your value within that certain domain.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, apparently we have a question in the.
Okay, I can see it. So Aziza wrote, I have a goal to write more a year. What is good writing frequency to be a prolific writer? 1 page once a day, sitting down for a couple hours once a week. What are the best advice? I went to a 3-week writing seminar where there was no internet in the room, and we sat for 8 hours and we had an hour break. And this was to get my thesis done. And one of the best things I learned was, I don't work well like that. I cannot sit for 8 hours and write, but I can write every day. And I do write every day. I write something every day. And even if it's one sentence, I make that sentence worthwhile. And so I have a running document. The other thing that I would say, and I'll be brief on this, is I learned a couple techniques, and one of them is set a timer and say, I'll write for 10 minutes. And make sure the timer goes down, not up. So you actually feel like you're being productive, like 10 minutes and go down. Woo, I did 10 minutes. That's fantastic. The other is, if you are at a complete stop and you cannot write, is to sit at your keyboard with a blinking cursor on a white document and type garbage, nonsense. Just type letters. Just do anything. Write about the sky and the color of it. Write anything. I see David nodding, so I'm excited to hear his thoughts too. And all of a sudden you'll realize that you'll say, and then why did that happen with my study? And what is that all about? And you can write any type of words you want. And then you find some golden nuggets in there when you go back and say, that was one of my blah days, but I was thinking about something in there. And you still feel like, you know what? I got on my computer. I wrote for 10 minutes. I wrote nothing. Or maybe there's something in there. Or maybe I got my grocery shopping list done. That's fine too sometimes. Yep. The last one is, how do you prioritize the impact factor or reputation of the journal with the need to publish quickly when choosing the journal to not get scooped? Oh, okay, Matthias, that's a tricky question. So I thought I could get away with not having to answer a question like that. I think one of the best ways to do this is to work with your team on your best approach. to look at your science and to determine, okay, where do we think this will really be valuable, that people will be able to see it, that they'll be able to cite it and be able to work with it. I have been scooped, but actually the scoop was really motivating for me to look at. Okay, we've done basically the same study, but not exactly. Really, truly not exactly. So then I took the opportunity to take the nuance of our study and really write comprehensively to make it a better, much better type of publication than I think it would have even been. So see it as an opportunity with those type of things. And that scooped can be on your shoulder. And for me, that isn't motivating. So I really try to make sure that I've got a really value-driven product that is really good when I the best that I feel I can do when I submit it. Again, thank you for the opportunity. I don't want to encroach in David's time. I'm looking forward to his talk.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, David, I'm going to stop sharing so you can go ahead and share yours.
I am infamously bad with technology, so give me just a minute. Hopefully this works.
While you do that, I'll just say I agree with Bernadette about, carving out a few minutes a day to write. It helps to do it, consistently every day, whether it's 10 minutes or an hour. Probably wouldn't go over an hour unless you really like deep writing time. But a little bit every day kind of helps you get into the flow of things.
Yeah, so I'm gonna touch a little bit on stuff. I think Bernadette, there's gonna be a little bit of overlap, so I'm gonna try to skip the overlapping stuff so that I can delve into some of the more exciting writing practice things. So hello, my name is David Puthoff. I am the scientific writer at MCRI, and I want to talk to you today about how to communicate good science through good writing. Not just functional writing, but writing that really comes alive on the page and communicates the importance of your findings and leaves your readers excited for your discovery. So I couldn't help but jump into some nuts and bolts also. So there's going to be a fair bit of that. The good writing doesn't just happen on its own. That's the unfortunate part. The good thing is it can be learned. So it's a matter of technique, right? And so I'm going to talk about just what sort of techniques can be helpful in the pre-writing through the writing stage. But here's a little bit about me. I graduated from the University of New Mexico not that long ago. And I've been a scientific writer in my role since 2021. Where does time go? I recently picked up a 0.1 research appointment, so I'm pretty proud of that. The key takeaway on the slide, of course, is my adorable cat, Stuffy. He's just a cute little tiger. He's there on his cat-sized couch. And some of the other things that might be helpful to know about me is I've taught technical writing and worked as a technical writer for 10 plus years. And I've studied a wide variety of rhetorical situations. I've studied poetry. I run a writing group for some fiction writers. So I've done a lot of different kinds of writing in addition to the technical kind. So here's a quick overview of the writing process as I'm going to talk about it. It should be helpful to people at any stage of their career. If you're more experienced, some of this will probably look familiar, but I swear that there are some bad habits I'm going to break you of as well. Undergrads, this comes with the caveat of always listen to your professors, but grad students, listen up so you can argue better with your advisors. So as Bernadette touched on, there are, and as Jen touched on, there are a lot of different kinds of genres of writing. I won't dive too far into this. It's just impossible to create a one-size-fits-all for writing situations. But the important thing from a sort of a writing and rhetoric standpoint is that good writing is often contextual. So you want to consider the context, but with that in mind, we can distill a few things that are going to be useful across contexts. And some of those are behavior. Some of them are just really good writing habits. For example, I want to touch on the free writes. Bernadette was talking about just sit down and write whatever comes to mind. It's actually something we talk about a lot in English composition. Is the best way to get to break writer's block is to simply sit down and start writing. And it can be nonsense. It can just be just I have nothing to say over and over. But eventually, the action of writing will fire neurons that will get you to write about something. And hopefully, like Bernadette said, that's something that's related to the project you have on your mind. So if you ever feel like you're being held back, that you don't know what to write, you don't know what you have to say, you can sit down with your data and then just do a free write. And eventually, you can pretty much count on some inspiration to show up. The IMRAD thing, I won't go into too much either. Again, it's important to recognize that what I want you to recognize here is that different journals will have different requirements. Some will make certain allowances and others will have certain insistences. So I want to come back to this. It's important for what it's an important setup for what I have to say later. And so these are the starting steps as I've come up with them. Write methods first, absolutely. Create graphics will definitely help you through. Reach out for your lit review help early. And this is especially useful. So when you're sitting down to write, you're thinking about writing, if you found perhaps 10 articles in that process to help you identify your research gap, look at those articles and think, not just these are my supporting sources, but these are my potential journals. If there are a few journals that repeat in those 10 or whatever, you know that those journals are interested in publishing what you have to say. Right? If you're publishing on that topic, then likely you might find some traction with those journals. And hopefully, in the process, you can offload some of this work to a co-author, a helpful librarian, or some other collaborator. The important thing to remember is we've been talking about how writing it's a growing process, right? It's a improving process, but it's also a social process. I really want to stress that. And it goes back to acknowledging your co-authors and things like that. It's really important to think of this as a social act and not just, I'm going to hole up in my room, I'm going to put on a pile of blankets and I'm just going to knock this paper out. But think, how do I make the best use of other people? How do I bring other people into my writing act for support, right? So that's the importance of the library and of your colleagues and of your other students to really be able to talk about your ideas. And we'll talk about talking about your ideas more in a moment. But the other, I think, helpful piece of advice I have here through my work as a scientific writer is that when you sit down to write, you don't want to only open up a blank page and start writing, from your method section, but you want to look at your target journals really early. You want to see what their instructions to authors are, right? So that you know what your word count is. If you have journal A and journal B, and journal A says they allow for 6,000 words total, and journal B says they allow for 4,500 words, and you have a pretty equal shot of landing in each, then start with the 4,500 word limit. It's really a lot easier if you write to the lower word count and expand maybe for the higher one than it is to start at the 6,000 and then try to chop down. We really want to try to minimize in the writing process any painful revision, right? So working with the constraints in place, understanding those constraints early on in the process really makes it easier to write and saves you that revision anguish. So some important things to think about here, going back to the writing as a social act, when you sit down to write your first draft, I can't stress enough how important I find it to write that draft as though you were talking to a friend. When we talk about plain language, you're going to be more likely to speak in plain language when you have a clear, concrete, familiar audience in mind. So think, don't sit down and think, I'm going to write for this journal, and then you try to write with this elevated, forced style. You come up with complex sentences, you're trying to come really complex ideas, your sentences end up really long and mangled and muddled, and the ideas are harder to get on the page. But if you think, okay, I've got a friend, co-author, whoever, and I can communicate my ideas directly to this person, then you say things like, and then they left out the big picture and didn't address those findings, right? That's easier to put on the page for a rough draft than it is to try to slog through, okay, the third gap that I have in mind for my research is that the broad trends, like that, it's not going to get you anywhere. If it does, it's going to take a very long time and it's going to be very difficult. So key takeaway here is to write to your friends first. Write that first draft like you're talking to someone. Just write it the natural way that you talk to the extent that you can, right? Err on the side of informality. Edit back in the complexities. So here's Stuffy with our key takeaways. Get to the editing as quickly as possible, right? Get through the writing, get to the editing. You can't edit a blank page. So those are the things to remember. Writing isn't this activity, again, like where you do it by yourself and get everything right on the first try. If you get to the editing, you can bring in a co-editor, right? And talk to somebody. You can share a draft. That's a very important part of the writing process, is just being able to share, even your free writes. It may look messy. Find a friend who's okay with reading your messy free writes. And actually, while we're on this subject, I feel like it's a good opportunity to talk a little bit more about what's holding you back. What kind of good writing practices help you be productive and get through the writing? I find it's really important to think about where you're writing. That may seem like a given, but it's not always. You should. I'm gonna confess, I struggle with ADHD. You've got to create a writing space where things are as clear as possible. You have to limit the number of distractions and choose them carefully, right? You can't get rid of them entirely, and you probably shouldn't. There's a little bit of like free thought that needs to rove around a little bit, but limit and be very conscientious about what they are. I find it helps to have an animal around, even if it's a stuffed animal. I know in computer programming, I have friends who talk to rubber ducks. It's a method. It's a tried and true method. You can talk to your stuffed animals. You can talk to Stuffy here, and just kind of bounce ideas off of somebody who can't reply, but you're verbalizing your ideas. So it makes it a little easier to get through the writing process and talk the way that you write. Here's some things about writing clarity, and these are things that might be a little bit more of the revising side, but I also want to just encourage you in your writing process to be bolder, right? Sometimes we hedge our bets. We don't feel a lot of confidence in our writing. We say things like, well, this seems to, or here we're suggesting, or the study implies, where you can just jump right to the point of the sentence. And so this also goes back to when you're talking with a friend, you're more likely to be confident. You're less likely to try to hedge your bets in your writing. So again, write in a direct manner, be bold. Instead of saying something like, our treatment improved cancer patient, or sorry, instead of saying something like, the study implies that our treatment improved cancer patient outcomes, you can say things like, our treatment improved cancer patient outcomes, and just trust that your reader is going to know that, your sample size is limited, right? That's covered in the paper. They know that it's a paper that's appearing in a journal, that it's not the last word. If you're talking about a particular context, you have to trust your reader to know that. So you've written your methods, your results, your discussion, all based on your findings. You've written it like you would to a friend, right? What's next? Well, of course, you end at the beginning. You write the introduction last, as Bernadette said. It's a great technique. And so got this famous Dale Carnegie quote here, but you can't really prepare someone for what you're going to say until you know what you're going to say. So you have to say it first. So this is erroneous advice sometimes. The other thing I want to put in here is edit for redundancy. Like, I know a lot of your writing teachers or in the sciences might say things like, your reader's going to skip around. And it's true. So you might be tempted to repeat certain things in each section to make sure that every reader reads the same important piece of information, right? I have an example. Among the variables that make our study unique, you want to emphasize the idea that your study is unique because we're filling a research gap. You have to find different ways to say that. You can't just copy and paste the same sentence, right? So while in the results section, you might say among the variables that make our study unique. In the conclusion, you might say instead, because we included factors previous studies had not considered, right? You make that the end of the sentence. So we revised for style at the end, and these are some nuts and bolts things that I really want to emphasize, and they're going to go into more detail when you get the resource guide from us at the end. But these are sort of some of these are big picture, like ideological, like things that we tell each other about writing. Oh, my science will speak for itself. That's a huge misconception. You have to consider yourself as the person who speaks for science. And so you have to understand that I think, as Bernadette said earlier, you want to get your citations. And one of the best ways to get citations isn't just through, you know, the algorithm or the search results, but it's to create some kind of word of mouth. Like, you have to engage the reader, but you should also get them excited enough to say, oh, I understand this. And my friend would really be excited to read it, right? I have colleagues who would be interested in this. I have a team that's interested in this, and then they share it out. So if your writing is enjoyable, actually enjoyable, readers will be more inclined to read and to share it, and then your citations go up, your influence goes up. And so some of the things that to keep in mind to either break you this bad habit or build this good habit in early: short sentences, right? Quick, easy to read, strong verbs. Get really good with verbs. And so you might think that a good sentence is flowery or long or has good adjectives, but it's actually verbs that make strong sentences. Punctuation helps. Don't be afraid to be a little bit on the creative side. You can use dashes, you can use parentheses to offset information. Semicolons are okay now and then. Try to edit out passive voice. Passive voices actually takes a little bit more work to do, but we hear it in kind of administrators speak a lot. Sorry, administrators, you write a little less like administrators. Every sentence needs a good subject and a verb. So here's just a little bit about short sentences. You can see things like they provide an example of can become they exemplify, where example here is the noun, and down at the bottom is they exemplify as a verb. See, it's a little stronger, a little more evocative, and it's definitely shorter. And you can see sometimes that your boring nouns should be turned into exciting verbs. And this is all stuff that we'll get into, I think, in later seminars. I just wanted to include it here so that you know that your best sentences when you're sitting down to write are the short ones that kind of come more naturally, right? So that's it. Thanks for letting me babble a little bit. A couple other things that I just wanted to touch on. We're writing sprints and body doubling, and these are concepts that come from my writing communities. Setting the timer to sit down, but having people with you is really helpful. So if you can get your friends to sit down with you in person, if you can talk with them over some kind of chat application, and you can write together. In the neurodivergent communities, we call that body doubling or parallel play. It's really helpful to have somebody who's kind of participating in their capacity with you. So that's what I have for you today. I hope that was helpful. I couldn't see anybody's faces. I had my face in my PowerPoint.
That was great. We have time for questions if anybody wants to add it to the chat. We did get a question about if there's going to be copies of the slides. We are recording this. That will be posted at some point in the future online. And then we will be putting a link to our resource guide that will have links to a lot of this information as well. That will be in the chat shortly, and then I'm going to send out email with it in there for those who are not with us right now. Yeah, open for questions. We have a few more minutes. There's one for you, David. How do you use writing to improve your research between data collection? Sometimes my papers still need data. Any ideas on how to write in a way that also helps stimulate, wow, I can't read apparently today. Stimulate next steps for one's research project.
That's a tough one. So there's this idea in I'm going to riff off of it a little bit, and I hope that I answer it in this roundabout way. But there's a kind of a idea that we use in composition that's writing to explore, right? And you don't always know what you're going to say until you start writing. Sometimes you might need to respond to a paper. You print up your research or whatever, put it side by side with your Word document. And just say, okay, this is what I understand from what I'm reading, and these are my responses to it. And that might spark some next steps. That's the thing that comes to mind. Bernadette, do you have anything good for that one?
No, I think you hit it on the head. I think that's an important piece of the direction we need to go and the energies that you're putting forth towards it. I think that's fantastic.
Anyone here, how can we reconcile different writing styles? Co-authors who prefer a Baroque style. that's, I think, comes a little bit towards who's first author, right? And maybe who your editor is. And then don't forget that the journals themselves are going to have editors as well, and they might have a house style. So again, it's a collaboration. And once in a while, the Baroque sentences might be acceptable. Just make sure that it's suitable to the information that the sentence is trying to convey.
I would just add one thing on that great answer is reviewers will identify if a manuscript looks as though people just cut and pasted from different types of viewpoints. So having a fluidity to it is often helpful.
Yeah. One last revision for coherent style, right? Do you think there's a use for large language models? Oh, that's a thorny question. That's such a thorny question. I think we have a whole panel for that, don't we?
Yeah, so that's a good plug for the next session. Next month, we're going to be talking about AI writing, different AI models, AI programs that are out there, the pros and cons, things like that. So keep that question for next time. And I put a link in there that will go to it's not a survey, it's a Google form that has our link to our resource guide, as well as a place to drop questions for the presenters next week. So if you want to drop that question on the form, we can have that ready to go for them. And we do only have a couple minutes left, so we can shoot through these last couple of questions before we go.
The next one I see is, what advice would you give someone who has never written a manuscript before and is feeling intimidated? And I think that really goes to imposter syndrome, right? Which is something I can definitely speak to, especially as somebody who's been in a lot of different fields and seen a lot of different kind of writings. I feel like an imposter in every single one of them. And sometimes, so you just have to do it. Like, the only advice I can give there is yeah, you're gonna feel like an imposter. You have to do it anyway. Do it and share it with somebody you trust. That is. You've just you gotta jump into it. And it's gonna hurt, and it's gonna be tough, but that's why you find someone you can trust. Bernadette?
Thanks. I would also say, if it helps, read those. Go back to what are the articles that really make a good impression on you. You're not going to plagiarize, you're not going to use their words, but find out the style that you really like. And you could even just take out blinking cursor, white piece of paper, a Word document, and look at what the article is and just try to write that first part. Try to write your abstract, try to write your first sentence, try to write your introduction, try to write your methods. That's, for me, it's always helpful, but find some good examples of good writing and let it help you and guide you. It's as though people are all around you. All those authors are saying, here's some good writing. So keep reading as much as writing.
Absolutely agree with that. That leads us into the next one too, the last one. I'm going to throw a link in the chat here. The question is, do you have any guides or structural formats that provide a specific outline, or should I just use journal articles as a reference? And you should do both. Definitely read more journal articles. I've thrown a kind of an article in here that was written a few years ago, but it's really useful. I pulled the figure from it on IMRAD, and it gives some tips about how to structure an outline. But there's no substitute for reading, and reading with this outline kind of side by side will help you identify the patterns in manuscript construction.
All right. Well, that is it. We have about a minute left, and I don't want to take any more of your time. We really appreciate everyone joining us today. If you have any more questions, feel free to shoot them our way. It's probably my email that you see everywhere, so shoot them to me. And if you have a question for David or Bernadette, I can pass it along to them. Otherwise, next month, like I mentioned, it is our tech and writing. So that is going to be our session about AI, as well as resources that we have here within the university system for citation managers. So it was great to have you all here today. Let us know if you have any questions, but otherwise have a great rest of your day.